in the wake of recent criticism from President Trump, let's welcome longtime Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan and historian Adrian Woolridge, political editor with The Economist. And we're just going to start out with the new book that is out, and then we'll get to Fed independence and Trump comments and all those things. But the book is called Capitalism in America, A History. Chairman Greenspan and Adrian, thanks for joining us. Can we just start with, you're writing a book on the history of capitalism. Do we have an addendum or an epilogue or a chapter for where we are right now in the viewpoint of capitalism, given that 60% of Democrats and a lot of young people are convinced that maybe it's the wrong system for us and we should do socialism?
Well, this is an issue which we discuss at length in the book, because as we move up through time, going back into the 1630s, we move up through time, we get ever closer to current policy. And where we come out at this particular stage is that there is stagflation ahead of us. And unless human nature is changed or does few tricks on us, this necessarily implies that real interest rates go up, because this is the tightest labor market I've ever seen. And so that means if rates go up, ultimately prices take hold. But concurrently, we've got a very slow productivity increase. 1.25%, maybe 1.5% a year, when we used to have twice that or more. This is having a significant impact on the GDP growth, and therefore it's ultimately the source of the populism which has infected the United States as it has Europe and others.
You point out that 10, 15, 20 years from now, the people receiving entitlements that they've earned throughout their life are going to vastly outnumber the people that are providing the work and the output to fund those entitlements. There's going to be a lot of people that are, and that's going to make it hard for productivity to go up, so it's going to be hard to grow.
Very much so. The Congressional Budget Office is currently forecasting very large increases in the deficit and therefore in the debt. And debt as a percent of GDP just a few years out, unless we reverse course, is getting close to the peacetime high.
Yeah. Adrian, just for a second, back to the original question about why we're once again questioning what economic system that brings us the most prosperity. It has been postulated that the longer capitalism is in force, that there's a permanent class that is built that forgets how they got.
Absolutely.
Has that happened? Absolutely. Is that where we are right now? That was Schumpeter, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was Schumpeter, exactly, who said that. The question at the heart of this book is, why did America become the world's greatest economic power? This country that was basically irrelevant in the 17th century, why did this country come from nowhere to become the world's greatest economic power? And we argue in the book that America has had an appetite for creative destruction, a tolerance for creative destruction, which no other country has had. Creative destruction is the force which constantly reallocates resources to more productive areas. And America, because of its size, because of its newness, because of its entrepreneurial spirit and its business culture, has had this appetite for creative destruction. And that has projected it to the position of the world's greatest power. Well, I just wanted to say, and that appetite is fading now in all sorts of ways. You can see endless indicators in terms of people's willingness to move, people's ability to create new companies, people's attitude, as you say, to capitalism. And one of the big things is that we have a whole class of people now who don't believe in capitalism.
Willingness to move, though, is tied into your ability to move.
Oh, yes, absolutely. No, that's a huge problem.
I mean,
absolutely.
that locked a lot of people in place.
Absolutely. No, that is a big problem, certainly.
There's no question, though, that our success has been part of the culture, the entrepreneurial culture you're talking about. But part of the thing that I wonder about is the real engine of the U.S. economy and success of our global ambition took place after effectively World War II. No. I think you don't think that's a. If you look at all of the U.S. companies,
it was the government.
No,
that's what he's getting to.
This is not an argument about the government. Okay. This is an argument about the rest of the world being out of business basically until 1980. You look at wages in America, and it was the first time that they started to stagflate was effectively in 1980, when the rest of the world effectively came back online. So for 40 years we were competing. Or we had a monopoly on the world. Do you not believe that?
I just want to correct you on just points of fact about history. The really extraordinary period is between 1865 and 1914. That is the period when America goes from being an almost round country to being the dominant power in every sort of industry, from cars to steel to oil.
And it's hard for Adrian to say that because it was his country.
And it was my country that was being displaced by.
Exactly.
That's when the government is playing a very minimum role in.
I'm not talking about the government playing a role. I'm talking about the fact that for many years,
that's true.
The U.S. had a huge advantage over the rest of the world.
But it was an advantage that was created in the late 19th century by America's ability to create companies which are just the best in the world.
I think Andrew's saying we think we're exceptional, like the Belgians think they're exceptional.
Still there. Remember, China, theoretically our closest competitor, has a per capita real GDP only a third the size of the United States.
But they got a lot more people.
And that's basically where we were in 1960.
Right.
So what happens is if you look at China, they're the biggest steel producer now by far. That's where the United States was in 1960.
But we're never more than, I think a president once said this, we're never more than one generation away from losing all this, theoretically. And I can't believe we're back arguing about why America's exceptional again and trying to discount the effects of free enterprise and entrepreneurial spirit and capitalism and everything else. Let me ask you about Powell, and because we got to do this at this point. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but I remember another president that got very angry at you it was the first President Bush.
There's been more than one.
Is this unprecedented to see President Trump jawboning the Fed about raising rates? No, but presidents don't like higher interest rates, typically.
If you go through the history of the Federal Reserve, especially in most recent years, you will find every president has an insight into how the markets work and where interest rates ought to be, which is always superior to that of the Federal Open Market Committee.
So they think.
I mean, the best thing that you can do if you're in the Fed is put earmuffs on and just don't listen. I mean, I was at the Fed for 18 and a half years. I have gotten innumerable notes, pledges, requests, etc., to lower rates. I do not recall a single instance in which somebody in the political realm said, we need to raise rates, they're too low.
But did you ever get direct either letters or conversations with the occupant of the Oval Office directly on that issue?
All the time.
All the time.
So, Jay Powell has said, or President Trump has said he hasn't spoken with Jay Powell about it. You had directly from...
Jay Powell was a first-rate Federal Reserve chairman, and you will observe, this guy knows what he's doing. I've known him for years. He's extremely competent, and while I don't comment on what the current policies are or how they're doing it, his competence is really such that I don't worry about where the Fed's going.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, the World Economic Forum, or the WEF, says that the United States is now the most competitive economy in the world again after a 10-year hiatus. We haven't been for 10 years. We've regained it. Why? What do you attribute that to? And is it policy? Is it time? What is it?
I attribute it to the fact that the rest of the world is doing worse. We're not doing that well. Our productivity increases are 1 to 1.5% a year. They used to be 3.
Is that demographics?
No, it's policy. It's basically, as we say in this book, and I've said in the previous book, what we're looking at is the impact of entitlements. The one statistic which grabbed my attention I was accidentally doing some ratios, and I came up with the fact that from 1965 to date, that the I don't know how to put it in simple terms, but that the sum of entitlements plus gross domestic savings is, as a percent of GDP, has been remarkably stable. And if you look at the two individual components of that sum, they work against each other, which very much implies that one is crowding out the other. So the question is it entitlements which are government authorized, or is it the market adjusting? And all of the evidence suggests that entitlements are embodied in the outlook, and that they will never change their pattern. They're mandated by law. Therefore, all of the impact is on a reduction. As entitlements go up, gross domestic savings goes down as a percent of GDP, and that plus savings borrowed from abroad, we've already accumulated $8 trillion in debt.
I think that's a very pessimistic outlook, because we've never seen entitlements. We've seen them, the increase flatten. We've never seen them actually go down, and we never will we? So how can we ever get out?
The answer is we're going to have to. And as we pointed out in the book, following Sweden of a decade or so ago, which had the same problems we're having now, only much worse, converted some of its entitlements, for example, to a way of accounting for them, and to significantly reduce the level of entitlement growth. It's still there, and unless we reverse it, we're in trouble.
How do you think about the tax cut? And we were having this debate in the 6 o'clock hour. The tax cut, what it's done, there was a report earlier this week that showed that revenues did increase. I would argue they didn't increase as much as they would have otherwise. I know that doesn't seem to hold water with you, but that's for Joe, not you.
Well, you're amazed that if you cut corporate taxes, the corporate revenues go down. You cut the taxes on the corporations.
Hold on.
To be able to
corporate tax revenues
went down.
would have been higher this year.
Yes.
But for the lower taxes.
Yes.
Okay.
That's why you cut taxes.
So they did not pay for themselves.
Well, no.
This idea they paid for themselves is completely crazy.
They paid for themselves on the individual side, because we actually have higher tax revenue. If we cut
overall tax revenue would have been higher.
Right.
But for
I understand
all
that.
Of the
I
tax
understand
revenue,
that, but
so you don't.
But the whole point of cutting it.
The idea that tax revenue is up this year is completely irrelevant. It would have been up anyway. The point is it would have actually been even higher otherwise.
We wanted to cut corporate. We wanted to cut. Yeah, go ahead.
Carry this conversation on in lower, fewer decibels.
So my question for you, though, my question for Mr. Greenspan is, when you think about this overall problem in terms of entitlements and revenues, what's the ultimate answer? Do you think that where we are in taxes makes sense to you, and the only thing we now need to do is reduce everything else?
The problem basically is that the actual corporate tax cuts were very helpful. They replicated what went on in other countries, and it's good. However, they're not funded.
Yeah.
You cannot create a large gap in the budget deficit without significant negative consequences eventually. So while it's true that the tax cut per se is good, it's only half the story.
But American corporate tax rates,
unless we fund it,
yeah,
they're not going to work.
But the point of cutting the corporate taxes was to leave more money in the corporation to risk and expand and everything. You're criticizing what we did on purpose.
But American corporate tax rates were completely out of whack with the rest of the world. 35%. It's very, very high compared with the rest of the world. And companies were responding to that by keeping huge cash piles of money sitting outside the United States, doing nothing at all. And the evidence we've seen from Ireland, which had exactly the same policy, is if you do that, of cutting corporate tax rates, is quite quickly you get an increase in investment as a result of that.
To cut corporate taxes and then say, oh my God, we've gotten lower revenues from corporate, that's the height of sophistry. That's why we did it. But that's a fallacious argument.
Alan, if you say that you want to fund it, how do you do that? I mean, they should have raised taxes on individuals at the same times, or they should be cutting spending.
I'm basically saying, I'm not going to suggest where the revenue side gets changed. I'm merely saying that in answer to Andrew's questions, he's saying, you know, is it good? In and of itself, it's the right policy, but it's only half a policy.
Yeah, right. Well, maybe you raise rates on individuals. Maybe you, I don't know how you do, but you want to unleash
I'm not about
the
to suggest fiscal policy. I have enough problems.
But spending and non-discretionary spending is where cuts need to come, don't they? Not discretionary.
Sweden has gone through the same thing we have. They made a major switch where the entitlement problems have now been resolved.
But through accounting?
Well,
one of the things they're doing is raising retirement age and linking retirement age to the average life expectancy of people. I mean, that's what you have to do.
That's anti-populist.
It's anti-populist, but unless you do that, you're just going to have more and more money being sucked into
should Medicare be means tested as well?
I'm not going to recommend what you should do in your country, but you've got to bring these things into balance.
You're a big admirer of our country. You can help us.
Here's what the real problem is. Back on page 299 or something in this year's report by the trustees of the Old Age and Survivors Benefit Program, Social Security, says that if we wanted to have an actuarially sound Social Security system, we have to cut benefits by 25% indefinitely in the future. I suggest to you it's on page 299, because that's the actuaries speaking, not the politicians who signed the report. But it's still there, and that's what the facts are. And the reason is the way Sweden got out of it is they go from a defined benefit system, which is what we have today, to a defined contribution, a 401k sort of thing. 401ks automatically create their own revenues, and they are never in deficit. And that's where the major gap problem is. So yes, they will slow down, and they will slow down for exactly the same reasons that Sweden solved the problem.
We have an election coming up. The soul or the geographic center of the Democratic Party at this point seems to be much higher, or much greater entitlements in terms of single payer, in terms of Medicare for all. I mean, we see the people, we see where the excitement is, and is that would make things worse, would it not?
You have to say Trump's not worried about entitlements. He's not doing anything. He's one of the first Republicans not to try and tackle entitlement.
But Bernie Sanders, or Ocasio-Cortez, or any of the real Elizabeth Warren, the excitement on the left is for more entitlements, is it not?
Absolutely. They're all involved in single entry bookkeeping. They don't like to do the debit side, just they want the credit side. And the world is double entry. And if you want to get ourselves into real serious trouble, don't attack this problem. I'm telling you, Sweden solved it. The solution is not economic, it is political. Yes. And the question is, do we have the guts to do what the Swedes did?
Well, Sweden also, I think, does have single payer, does it not? And that's always what's held up as an example of how we should run our health care here. And then the critics always point out that it's 9 million people or something. It's not.
Well, all you have to do is get the correct financing system that creates the revenues that the entitlements create. And to be sure, as the population ages, we're going to build up ever-increasing entitlement levels. And as far as I can see, everyone is blinding themselves to that fact. It's built into the data. The Congressional Budget Office forecasts that there's major troubles ahead. Nobody is listening. The reason they don't listen is that the financial community doesn't care about bookkeeping. What they care about, which is what they're going to confront, is inflation. Remember, inflation back in the 70s, 1971, 4 or 5% caused Richard Nixon to put wage and price controls on. And the reason he did is as the inflation rate went up, the politics got extremely unstable. But it is not the fact of the entitlements per se that's doing it.
Do you remember when you told us to put the 10-year up, and we have ever since? We always have the 10-year.
You wanted to see it on the screen.
You wanted to see it on the screen. That's what you need to see. So are we in a new normal in terms of where the 10-year is going to be over the next 5 years or so? Would you have ever predicted this would be normal to see a 10-year struggling for the yield to get above 3.25%?
Well, let's put it this way. All of the long-term interest, indeed short-term interest rates, in the last several years are the lowest in American history. As part of the data system in our book, we carry interest rates all the way back. And we do have government yields going all the way back, with the exception of 2 years. Those 2 years didn't have any because there was no debt. I mean, that sounds incredible. This is not, I don't mean there's no deficit, right, but there's no debt. And as a result, we are in uncharted territory, really.
What were those 2 years we had no debt?
Sorry, what?
What were those 2 years that we had no debt?
1834 and 36.
Yes.
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson.
You know, he may well have been a populist in the conventional sense of the word, but he was a fiscal bear.
Hated banks.
Can you write the next 10-year chapter on capitalism in America? What do you see?
Well, we really argue in this book that America's current slow growth in productivity is a policy choice. It's not something that's the result of being a mature economy. It's not something that's the result of technology not having the push that it ought to. Or even demographics, because America's demographics is not as bad as many other countries. America could easily go back to being this paragon of creative destruction and a very rapidly growing economy if it wasn't for some very foolish policy choices. The problem is to have better policies, you need to have better politicians and better governance, and we're not seeing many signs of that at the moment.
Can I ask you just a larger question about this, about capitalism, which of course is being challenged, or at least people are raising questions about it, in terms of the inequality that it has created. And this is why I go back to what I was talking about, sort of post World War II, and the competition or lack of competition in the rest of the world. I would make an argument to you that the fact that there was less inequality during that period was a function of the fact that we were not competing on a global scale, meaning because we had a monopoly, the labor movement was allowed to move forward. All sorts of things were able to be paid for effectively, if you will, that today are much harder to pay for given the competition and the global competition that we have. And therefore, it raises questions to the degree that people have a view about what capitalism and the American dream looked like in the 1950s and 60s relative to today.
I mean, I think there are two determinants. One is public policy and public policy choices, and the other is global competition. But I think that when you're thinking of inequality, there are two sorts of very different sorts of inequality. One is inequality that's produced by somebody like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates coming up with some brilliant idea which produces products which everybody wants, makes them cheaper and better. And the other is the inequality that comes from cronyism, from political connections. Now, the first sort of inequality, I don't really worry. I don't worry about Bill Gates or Steve Jobs when he was alive having so much money. I do worry about connections and cronyism, because what inequality is often a sign of is that somebody's come up with an idea which makes everybody else's life much, much better. But in terms of the size of the American middle class, I would say that if you have a functioning, successful education system, you're doing much more to create the foundations of a stable middle class than if you have a trade union movement.
And wouldn't a competitive world that they're competing with us, but they're also raising their own standard of living, which allows us to sell into them? I mean, you're a globalist, but when it comes down to it, now you're worried that the globalism is what's not allowing the American dream to happen anymore? Can't we sell to the billions of people in China? Can't they wear Levi's? Can't they?
Absolutely.
If it wasn't for the tariffs,
absolutely.
the trade war.
But for many, many years, they didn't have a McDonald's to compete against.
So it was the labor movement that allowed all the prosperity to
Not the prosperity. I'm not suggesting the labor movement created the prosperity.
Okay.
I'm saying the labor movement created. Actually, that's not true. The labor movement created, to some degree, this.
So because of World War II, we really didn't build these companies? That you're back to we really didn't build this?
I'm not making a government argument at all.
No, but
this has nothing to do with the government.
The American exceptionalism is because it was a loaded deck from the.
I believe that in the late 1800s and the early 1900s,
it was
we built
easier.
some remarkable companies that were then able to get a huge leg up on the rest of the world because the rest of the world was out of business,
Mr.
and that allowed it.
Thank you. We've got 5620 is our heart out. Thank you, Adrian. Capitalism will survive. Thank you. We'll be right back.